All roads lead to power, and on this show we're going to break that idea down a little bit. What is power? Who has it? And how do you get it? I'm your host, Jeff Coulard. Welcome to the show.
It's a realization that power without love is reckless and abusive, and that love without power is sentimental and anemic.
Because the so-called real world of men and money and power hums merrily along on the fuel of fear and anger and frustration and craving and the worship of self. The really important kind of freedom involves attention and awareness and discipline.
If people don't learn power, people don't wake up. And if they don't wake up, they get left out.
Okay, welcome back to another episode of Powerful. I'm your host, Jeff Coulard, and today's episode I'm really excited about a conversation. We're going to dig into some big topics, these ideas of diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice, with a fellow named Farzad, who is, he's out of New York, Virginia, actually. He's a consultant in the DEI space, and I've really gotten to know him through his LinkedIn posts, which he doesn't shy away from posting things that are maybe a little bit on the edge, a little bit controversial, and so I'm excited to explore some of those ideas with him tonight. And if you're tuning in live, by all means, throw your comments down. If you've got questions for myself or Farzin, then don't hesitate to ask them. And if you're tuning in after the fact and you're listening to the show via audio, then thank you for tuning in. And without further ado, Farzin, thank you so much for making some time tonight.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff, for having me. This is great.
Yeah, well, let's maybe start just by exploring a little bit of your background, give a little bit of context, enough context so that people know kind of your perspective and where you're coming at this conversation from. And so you're a diversity, equity, inclusion, justice consultant, facilitator. How did you get into that work? What brought you into it?
So thank you. And thank you for including the word justice in there. I myself typically just go with DEI, but like justice is such a huge part of what I do. And that's particularly stems from, I think, my background in minority rights and advocacy. So in my 20s, after grad school, I started doing a little bit of work with my own ethnic group. I'm from an ethnic minority from Iran, ethnically Azerbaijani, and I was able to kind of get into that area and do kind of build sort of my network in that space and learn about the struggles of various different groups of people all across the world. And I got a chance to kind of represent my ethnicity in the Minority Rights Forum in Geneva and things like that. And so that basically solidified my foundation. Over time, I did some work in, cultural organizations, nonprofits, did a overseas program for a couple years. And then coming back to the US, I just kind of happened to fall into talent acquisition in a higher education institution here in the DC area. But eventually started lobbying for myself because of this background that I had. Ended up doing DEI work at the university, then in the corporate world, in the law area for a little bit, and then local government. And then eventually last summer, I kind of took all that experience and packaged it up and started my own company. So here we are.
Let's talk about that decision for a second. What prompted that decision, or what helped push you in that direction? Because I've made that leap myself, and I've got lots of friends who have made that leap, and it can be a daunting one. What pushed you in that direction?
It is. It was a daunting decision. I think. I mean, to be honest with you, it was just friends and family be like, you got to go out on your own. Like this is, some of the things that I would complain about in my past workplaces, and some of the things that I was like, man, I wish blah, 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 or I wish I had the opportunity to blah, blah, blah. And, people were like, we read what you write on LinkedIn, you have something to say, create your own framework and then take it to that level. Right. Because, I was always like, even back when I just started out, I was ranting about the quote unquote business case for diversity, right?
Mm-hmm.
And how like it's so dehumanizing. And then like, but there was that, yeah, but we have to get the buy-in. We have to sell this thing. So, and it always rubbed me the wrong way. And so I think talking to my wife and my friends, they all kind of urged me to be like, you know what, do it. Like it's you have the background. You have a unique background given the fact that you've worked in the advocacy space. So you're centering equity and justice. And then I attended some trainings from people who were doing just that, working solely like centering justice, right? And I was like, this is me. I have to do this, right? They're not constrained by, of course, I mean, you have some constraints, like you can't just like go 0 to 100 all of a sudden, but like, but more or less they're talking about real issues. And so I want to do that.
Let's talk about that. That seems like a good jumping off place to talk about DEI work. And because that's a big, like, that's a huge basket of work to be done. And when we add justice or liberation, and we add some of these, like, this is a huge piece of society. Like, this is a big conversation, I think, that we're wrestling with right now. And I would love to get your sense or your perspective on like what's going well and what's not going well. Like where are we not making progress? Where do you see progress being made? What are some of the classic traps that people get into or organizations get into with DE&I? And so I know you mentioned like the business case, and that's an interesting one, being, from the majority, somebody with power. Like I'm often selling the business case to my clients for lots of different types of work, which I would rather sell just the humanity of it, right?
Yeah.
Or really like the ethics of it to people. But
Right.
what gets me in the door is the business case. And so that's one we can go down that rabbit hole for sure. But let's start more broadly. Your perspective on DEI work, the sector at large, what's going well, and where we're running into roadblocks.
So I've been fortunate to kind of use my LinkedIn network to connect with people who are doing DEI work all across the globe. South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, Netherlands, France, Brazil, and I've had some really good conversations, and the things that I suspected were like really confounded, like were confirmed by my conversations. And the thing about this country that I've noticed that's working well is, first, let's split this work into the material world and the ideological world, right? So the material world is the structures of and systems of oppression, white supremacy, patriarchy. The material world that's affecting access to capital, creating disparities in income, housing, education, the real things that are tangible things that are affecting people's lives. And the ideological world is your anti-racism book clubs, like the, people's minds, deconstructing biases, kind of that kind of thing. Unfortunately, it took the murder of an individual to kind of bring us there. But we're at a point where ideologically, I think we're way further advanced than a lot of even advanced economies out there, countries that are doing that are kind of like starting on this work, and that's goes to the nature of our country being a country of extremes. Like we dip to the lowest low, then kind of our ideologies account for that, and then we create the sort of history and the sociology, and then the narratives to kind of justify progress, right? Mm-hmm. So in that respect, we're doing well, right? We're much more open about talking about systemic racism than we ever have, which is great. The education is kind of increasing far further than a lot of other advanced economies. On the systemic end, the material end, however, it's regressing. I mean, Canada, France, Australia, they have social safety nets that, like, they're universal, of course, but they create a baseline where those disparities are much more muted than they are here. We have wide disparities because of our inability to take this ideological framework and turn it into action. So they're further advanced by the default nature of their society, right? So, and it's showing up now in ways that are very horrific. So, Native Americans are dying indigenous peoples are dying at twice the rate of white populations in the United States. You can read anything about like how COVID is affecting communities of color, like much, much higher than wealthy white communities. I mean, even before the pandemic hit, the average, what was it? The baseline family wealth measure of white families was 10 times that of black families. And that is specifically due to these systems and processes that we put in place deliberately through the nexus of government policies and corporate practices, right? Like they created redlining policies, and then like that ended up creating ghettos in the United States, which were food deserts. And because prices of homes were artificially elevated, then that left little money for other, for money to go to other aspects of the economy. Then because of that, like tax revenue shrunk, and then taxes feed into our education system because that's how our education. So all of these things systemically are way out of whack here in the United States. But in the ideological realm, we're doing better. Like we'll paint Black Lives Matter on a street, right? I mean, and we're okay with that. I mean, not everybody's okay with that, of course, but like we can do that. But what about actually, wealth in these communities? What about health in these communities? What about education and so forth? So that's where I see us right now. But I mean, at least we're talking about it more so than we have ever in the past. I think. I hope.
It certainly seems that the conversation has been amplified and extended. It hasn't just been a blip, at least from the Canadian perspective. And it's interesting for you to name Canada, because I look around and I see how our Indigenous people are treated and how the health and income disparity there. And it's pretty extreme too. We've got a lot of work to do in healing those relationships. But
sure,
let's talk a little bit about the traps that organizations get into, or what you see, because how do I frame this question? It's something to do with like performative allyship or performative change. And I see a lot of that. And I come in on the heels often of a lot of performative type activities at the organizational level, where it's, we need to do some diversity work. And so we'll hire someone to come in and do a lunch and learn on a topic, a narrow sliver of diversity topic of some kind. And we'll check that off. Check, we've done our diversity work for the quarter or for the year or for whatever. And I'm like, it's not exactly like, that's not changing any structures or systems. And so as somebody who, wants to work on transforming the system, how do we move away from that? Where have you seen success in organizations? And I guess what needs to be present in the side of an organization for change to really take root or take hold? Or what have you noticed about that process?
So honestly, the best organizations are the ones where their leadership is fully committed. I mean, and was fully committed prior to last summer. Yeah. I mean, the conversation around performative allyship, the reason why it exists is because there's a perverse level of accountability out there right now that it's not authentic accountability. So companies are responding and surviving in a way not to change their business practices, but use their DEI programs as a marketing initiative, right? I'm doing this. Look what we're doing. Let's celebrate this. Let's throw this. I mean, we had this many lunch and learns. We had this many DEI consultants come in, and so if if you want to really change the culture of the institution, you have to commit to really understanding how you're doing business and how you're making profit. It boils down to that. Like, if you're willing to sacrifice certain parts of your day-to-day operations, that goes from performative to real, right? So sometimes you don't have to. Sometimes you don't have to. I mean, you may be in a space where you're providing services and you've organically created a very responsive organization, and that's very unlikely, but like, it could happen. But the idea is that that allyship has become this sort of marketing business tool, as opposed to something where we're actually really deconstructing what the workplace looks like and how we're serving our clients. And so if it's a constant state of sort of review, and if it's this authentic accountability where we're actually kind of looking how we're interacting in the workplace, how we're breaking down barriers for people of color, and including the histories of oppression and injustice in those workplace practices, and understanding how power manifests in the workplace, and then understanding if we are contributing to disproportionate outcomes for the society at large, right? If our business practices are wholly hyper-capitalist and contributing to disparities, then that is true ally. That is doing the work, right? In a lot of my trainings, I talk about the idea that your organization is not a closed system. You're a part of society, right? You cannot, even this conversation right here, it's not this closed conversation where it's just me and you in the room. It's my 37 years of life, plus my parents coming to the United States, and me when I was a kid coming to the United States, and then their history of relationship with their ethnic group in Iran. And so it is a constant. There are things about our just situational interactions and a situational place in the organization that we tend to ignore, that are very important, and going along with the theme of your podcast being power. So
how do you help people see those connections, or how do you help people see that bigger narrative? Because I think one thing that I run into a lot is we live in a hyper-capitalist, but also a very hyper-individualized, Western societies. It's all about the individual, and it can be hard to see past. And I think that's where we run into a lot of the politics of diversity, where we get this identity politics, and it's like, just because I'm a white man doesn't mean I haven't suffered, so don't tell me I'm privileged, and all of the narratives that are obviously wrong from a systemic view. But at the individual, if we walk around the world looking at it through our own set of perspectives, it can be hard to connect. And so a lot of the work that I do is helping people see the bigger picture. But I'm curious about if that's part of your work, and how do you do that? Because it's probably the most challenging part of my work, if I'm frank, to get people out of their individual narratives into the bigger perspective of society at large, and how groups intersect with each other.
Right. No, I appreciate that. I mean, I use a lot of visuals. I take concepts and try in the slides that I use, I try to make it very visual. For example, in 1959, two French scientists designed this 5 dimensions of power model. I have my own way of visualizing that, plus I add privilege to that. And so there's that kind of visualization tends to help. And also when I'm talking, I tend to talk about the power you hold in every space you occupy, and to be mindful of that, and to show, for example, I occupy a certain degree of power if I'm a manager or supervisor, all the way up to CEO. But I also occupy a certain power in a space as a man. I occupy certain power, or I have certain power in the fact that I'm white approximate, right? That I'm white passing, so to speak. But there's also areas where I'm marginalized. And so as an immigrant, for example, I haven't had the same experience as some of my American colleagues, I guess, like born here. And so I talk about like the spaces of identity that you have, and you living in a space of power on a spectrum in each of those identities. Certain parts of those identities, like class, race, gender, have a much greater outcome and create much greater hurdles to your upward mobility, to your growth and development than others, right? One of the spaces that you can hold power is where you live. That's a to some degree, like you have, depending on whether you live in Montana or California, you can have a greater vote based on the what is it, electoral college system in the United States, right? That is a certain degree of power. Is that vote, that happens like once every few years? Like, is that going to really affect your commute to work, where exactly, the opportunities that you have? I mean, it's unlikely. It's still a degree of power, but it's unlikely. But if you are from a community that has been in one of these redlined districts that eventually became, what we've referred to as ghettos in the past, where you don't have the access to education, you don't have the any sort of opportunity to. I mean, you like your mental health is completely affected by the things around you. And all of these stem from a deliberate system of oppression created as a result of race. That is a different level of power, right? Like, so there are certain. I mean, like to kind of, and I use the dimensions of diversity, and I talk about like this is the levels of identity you have, and this is the spectrum of power. You have to always be mindful of those. Always be mindful of the power you hold in the space you occupy or the space you're in, whether that space is literal, physical, or whether it has to do by virtue of your birth and your name and your skin color and that kind of thing. And so to kind of round it out, long story short, I have a lot of very visual ways of putting these concepts and then framing them so that it's not just like, well, I suffered too, I have, because everybody has everyone's the hero of their own story. Everyone's on their own journey. Everyone has their own hurdles, but some people have more hurdles than others. But it's hard for me to see that because we have this concept we call like blind spots, which is an ableist term, but unawareness, right? Because of our own unawareness, because we are focused on our own troubles and our own journey and the things that we've had to overcome ourselves. And so, when I'm showing these visualizations, I talk about exactly what you're saying, these intersections. So race and social class tend to be the biggest determinant of how you are going to survive in this country. Gender is also, and even biological, like what they call biological sex, which isn't a thing, but but gender is a huge determinant of exactly like where you're situated as well. So these things compound these things, and it's not just like a 1-to-1, like, right? It's 1+1. Like the intersections amplify each other and then create a new space. Latinx womanhood, right? Or Latina identity is a compound. It has a compounding effect, occupies its own space than being, just generally like a Latino plus a woman, right? There's an intersectional compounding effect that creates its own space, and that there's power in there too, or lack thereof. So the intersections are important, and I just kind of try and visualize this as much as possible.
Yeah, no, it's helpful. It's a nuanced conversation that I think a lot of us are unused to having, especially those with power. You know, as someone
Yeah.
who I tick all the boxes when we look at I call it status power. It's called status power in the right use of
Hmm.
power model. So in the right use of power model, there's 5 different types of power. There's personal power, there's role power, there's status power, there's collective power, and then there's
Sure.
structural or systemic power. And the first 3 are really individualized: personal, role, and status. I can intersect with those and I can understand those. Collective and systemic are harder to see, especially for people who have power, who belong to like the power majority. And so that's one thing that I've noticed a lot of, is that when you have power, it's hard to see. When you don't have power, it's obvious, right? Because you suffer the consequences or the disproportionate lack of choice and mobility that comes with that power. And so it's a bit paradoxical that the people who have the most power are the least attuned to it and the least aware of it and most
Yeah.
at risk of misusing it and abusing it, which we see way too much of. How do you help organizations, or I guess what's your stance on or perspective on how to measure the impact of this work? Because we talked a little bit off the top, and I think what originally attracted me to one of your LinkedIn posts was this business case for diversity, and that's one way to measure impact, obviously, and that's the classic Western capitalist way to measure impact, was like, what's the bottom line return on investment here? But beyond that, the human side of things or the experiential side of things for people and organizations, how have you seen organizations do a good job of measuring impact or tracking change over time? Yeah.
So, I mean, I tend like there's that like, so diversity is the easiest, right, to track. You're just looking at numbers. You're looking at you look at your EEO form and see rise in top 5, 10, 20% of said demographic. I'm not against that per se, but it's not a focus of mine. So for me, I think the organizations that do it best are constantly doing a pulse check, culture survey, engagement survey, and even the water cooler talk, and eventually like just kind of a sense for. And this all, I mean, you can build all this into an engagement survey, just how the organization is flattening out with when it comes to power distance from individual contributors all the way to the CEO or whatever. I think these types of cultural assessments do more to get a sense for where you're at in the organization, because they end up building your reputation. And that reputation is the biggest attractor of diversity for your company. So, if you look at companies like Ben and Jerry's or Patagonia, as we were talking about, like, they've built that reputation. They like, people are like, I would have never thought to work for an ice cream company, and I want to work at Ben and Jerry's just because of like all the cool stuff that their leaders are doing. So like, so I think like in the realm of like holding yourself accountable and tracking it in metrics, I tend to center the equity and inclusion piece over the diversity piece, and that goes to the like. Yeah, I mean, I do audits, I do culture surveys, I try but like, I caution, against the relying too heavily on big data and relying heavily on metrics too much. I mean, it's important, right? You have to have a data-driven sort of policy, but I think there's a lot of things that, like your well-being in an institution, it's going to take some time to be able to kind of put those into, like, build those out into a survey and figure out how to frame them so you get the right answer. So I tend to kind of just like kind of tell organizations to focus on the workplace experience more than I do any particular metric. Metrics are good, but I mean, they're not absolute. So so on that sort of trajectory, when you're kind of creating a reason to sell this, like get the buy-in, of course, like if you're selling to the CEOs and the leadership, they're very, a light bulb goes off if you quote the business case for diversity and say, like you read McKinsey, you read PwC, you read all those big Deloitte, all those big audit firms are putting out studies of how like the diversity with the inclusion piece increases productivity by 20, 30, sometimes 40%, and then output and profit, blah, blah, blah. That's whatever, right? To me, I've always hated that because I focus on the internal experience so much. That is very dehumanizing for your existing employees, right? It is like you're almost commodifying something very human about me, and it's being bought and sold. So it's almost like I'm hired for my identity, and that identity is increasing profits for you. And so it is a very like alienation of who I am. And so that tends to be problematic. And so that's the business case. And then there's a moral human case for diversity where it's just like the right thing to do. And that's an easy one. But of course, not everybody's driven by morality, right? Like, especially profit-seeking organizations.
As evidenced by most of our capitalist structures and tendencies.
Sure.
And maybe that's a question, because I've noticed that thought train. For me, usually this conversation is a hop, skip, and a jump to like, well, capitalism is kind of rooted in this like settler colonial capitalistic structure the last 400 or 500 years, at least in North America, is really built on exploiting human labor and human resources. I hate that term too, for profit and for gain and for, an accumulation of wealth for shareholders and or, C-suite executives. And so I guess for me, it's like, unless we're going to talk about that, unless we're going to address some of those issues and the morality of capitalism, anything downstream of that is not going to be a perfect solution. And maybe that's the question that I've got is, DE&I done imperfectly, is it still better than or done for suspect morals, right? Or for a profit motive? Is that better, different? What are your thoughts on that? I mean, that's a big question to drop halfway through the podcast, but
that's heavy. So DEI in and of itself, as it is right now, is heavily a part of the capitalist system. It already is that way. It is not. It is like, I would venture to guess in its originality there was a social justice piece to it, but we've distanced ourselves with that like over the past 30 some odd years, and then now it's starting to come into the forefront again. Mm-hmm. But if you look at studies over the past, that they did over 10, 20 years, you can find a number of things that show exactly why DEI programs aren't working, or like a lot of DEI initiatives to increase diversity in the organization have like either at best like have been a function of population growth, in those communities, rather than a deliberate attempt to. So is I guess having a DEI team, is it better? Like that's a tough one. Is it better than? I mean, if you have one, it's performative. I don't know how to answer that. I mean, for whom though? Like for your existing employees, I think there is an element to celebrating your culture. And if there's a certain degree of celebration when it comes to like living in the like being in the workplace and being like a sense of pride in your identity and ability to share your culture, sure. I mean that's good for 15 minutes, right? You feel good about yourself, and then you're back to your daily grind, right? in that aspect, sure. I mean, I think like celebrating identities, like getting Juneteenth off is a popular thing happening in the U.S. In companies. That's a good thing, and a quote easy, quick win that is so popular in this space. Mm-hmm. But it's very much. I mean, it's giver. I mean, yeah, but very like I would say yes, but like in a very slightly. So one of the things I'm interested in now is, over the next few months, I'm going to try and basically marry the DEI field, social justice piece of it, with the economic justice that's like kind of popular in some more progressive companies. Like looking at unionized labor, looking at employee-owned organizations, looking at like culturally flat organizations, looking at places where like power is much more diffused and the lessons drawn. Those I think, and I posted about this today. Those I think institutions have the DNA to have a much more robust D&I program or DEI program.
That's interesting. I'll let you off the hook here to think for a sec, because that is a big question that I don't have any of the answers to for sure. Interesting around the flatter organizations. That's actually a lot of the work I've been doing the last little while with some clients, is around building in some self-organizing and holacracy. I don't know if you're familiar with kind of holacracy or sociocracy, but they're very much very flat, like flatter, trying to distribute power and make it and do more consensus-based decision making and some of those pieces to really try and neutralize some of the tendencies of hierarchies to accumulate power and use it poorly. If you break that apart and you build in the structures for it and build in some rules around who has power, it's a fascinating place to explore, not without its own challenges. I mean, anytime humans come together to try and organize themselves to do meaningful work and there's profit involved, I think there's, we'll see what sticks and what happens, but there's some tendencies there. Let's talk a little bit about where to start. If somebody's listening to this conversation and they're like, yeah, we need to do something for the morality of it, for the human-centeredness that is a good DEI program, where do you recommend people start that conversation or that journey? Or is there a good place to start? Is it just get going, or like what's the path for somebody or an organization that's really passionate about it or wants to do a better job of it?
Well, I think it depends on your resources at a given moment and what you're allocating for. So like, if you're a leader and you are thinking about what's happening in all across the country, when it comes to racial justice, when it comes to effects of the pandemic and the economic effects, and so you're interested in kind of starting something, I think the easiest thing to do at this is to kind of assure your organization that you're going to take this seriously. Kind of start with some type of messaging. Your employees of color and your women employees have probably been saying certain things about the organization for as long as they've been there, and you probably haven't been listening. And so to kind of one of the things that's very hard to grasp that I talk about, and it's kind of jarring a little bit for a lot of people, is that I talk about the legacies of bad policies in the past and how it is important to correct for them at some point. Now is a great time, right? If you've done something, if your organization has been, I'm not saying like legal, doing. I mean, you could have done some discriminatory practices in the past that were overlooked. But even some artificial barriers that you erected for certain people that have affected their lives, and they're in a certain position and they've stayed in that certain position and weren't able to move up. reevaluate those processes. And so make amends for past decisions. But the way to do that, I think, is to either, I mean, you can obviously always hire an outside consultant if you have the resources to do so. But a lot of organizations now are creating task forces that eventually become DEI councils, and making it very open and honest, right? This isn't a way to just get some, like, it's not a pressure release valve. It is really meaning, like, you're not trying to take the edge off a little bit by having this and checking some boxes. You're really trying to organically get the experience of your employees from communities that have been traditionally marginalized, and listen to them. And so a council is a great way. If you're going to create a council and they're charged with leading conversations, that can backfire easily. So, there are trained facilitators out there that will give you the framework for having conversations around race or gender. Like, I think a lot of these equity councils are tasked with let's hold a conversation, and then they go just into the fact that it's a free for all. Let's just talk this through, and people don't have the right foundation to be able to talk about these things, right? You have to understand the history of this country, the real history of this country, to understand where people are coming from. You have to lay the foundation for colonialism, slavery, Jim Crow, redlining, the racist like policies toward indigenous communities, all of these hierarchies that have been developed over time. You have to know that in order to have a meaningful conversation. Otherwise, you're assuming everybody's coming at this as, I mean, for lack of a better term, equals, but which they are, but not equality of experience. Mm-hmm. And so, so there's a journey to take, right? I mean, I don't want to be kind of selling the field or whatever, but like there is something to be said about people who have training in this space that are able to kind of navigate you through that, through those conversations. So, if you're going to do it organically, and like, I mean, it's always good to allocate money toward this because it's very, very important. And, it should be a part of your organization, separate to human resources, actually. Mm-hmm. But if you're young, or if you're or a new organization and you want to kind of start exploring it, it is okay to invite people to kind of start. Let's start talking about it, but let's figure out a way to do this properly, to understand whether you're hiring somebody or it's, like somebody in your organization has the institutional knowledge to host a conversation like this, which many organizations have. But foundationally, like, your organization has, unless you're completely homogenous, you have the makeup to have a really robust DEI program by the merit of the human capital, or like the employees that you have existing. So, mm-hmm. I hope that answers it.
I think it does. I think that's great advice to get to a shared understanding of what it is we're here to talk about, and that's why I found that power conversations, and particularly this right use of power idea, tends to cut through a lot of the noise. I find DEI work very noisy, and I think because it's so fragmented, there's so many, different, and maybe it's a commentary on our society that we've got so many discrete groups of marginalized and oppressed people, right? From gender to sexual orientation to like indigenous or immigrant or black, and like it's just, there's no shortage of groups. And my sense and my experience in this is that it's become very fragmented conversations. And so I'll have leaders who are stuck in, do we add our pronouns to our email signatures? And that decision takes them 6 months or a year, or they never actually get to making it. And I'm like, why are we talking about that first? Yeah. Like, that seems like that's something that will make sense as soon as you understand some of these foundational pieces of of equality, equity, justice, like these decisions will not be hard for you. They're hard right now because you don't have a shared language and understanding of what it is we're here to talk about.
Oh, I'm so happy you said that. I actually just wrote an article called well, I can't remember what it was called, but I was ranting against the DEI quick wins. You know, the simple gestures you can do to, and they sort of take on a life like exactly like you just demonstrated. They take a life of their own. Like the quick wins become the long-term goal, and so so you need that. Like, and power is so important to this conversation. It's been left out. Like, you know, the field was called diversity and inclusion. Then they added equity, and that wasn't enough because like there's more to it. And then so they started including justice and different dimensions of the combinations of inclusion and belonging and the systemic work, which is justice and equity. But so but yeah, that foundational piece I think is so important to consider. And I do that, right? Like sometimes people will come to me and request a bias training. And, I'm going to be like, okay, right. I'm not going to go in and say everybody has biases and blah, blah, blah. Like it's some sort of revelation, right? Saying everybody has biases is like saying everybody has a brain, everybody has a mind. It's your mind. It's your pattern recognition. That's all bias. Like,
it's turned into this like, oh, I just have this bias. That's why I don't like personality testing, because then people hide behind it and they just say, oh, that's just my bias showing up, or that's just my red. I'm a red. I'm like, no, you're not. Yeah. You're using that as an excuse to hide behind the fact that you don't want to change.
Exactly. And it's like it's like DEI shouldn't be this much fun. Right? Like there shouldn't be this much positivity in this field. It is solely should be in the realm of dismantling. I mean, there's a celebratory piece to it, but dismantling these systems. So when somebody comes and asks me about like bias training, I'm going to talk about the history of colonization in that. And they're like, how is that possible? Well, biases come from stereotype. Like, all these inputs kind of are embedded in your brain, and they come from mythologies created to oppress and created to hold power over people, right? Mm-hmm. And without that understanding, what do you do? Like, oh, I just learned about a bias. What are you going to do with that information, right? Like, if you're an individual contributor, you have biases. Are you really going to affect somebody's life to the degree where a hiring manager does, or extrapolate that into society where like people in Congress do? Like your biases will show up in harm if you hold power in a space. Mm-hmm. And so understanding that fundamental having that fundamental understanding of power is necessary, and understanding how racism is structured and like is built into our structures that eventually biases act upon that framework is super important. Like that's why, like I thank you for saying the foundational piece of it, because this is a huge part of what I center in my work.
Yeah, and I see that as being how we move past some of that performative quick win checklist style, is to actually dig beneath it. And if we look at the isms, the racisms, the sexisms, the ableisms, when we look past those. Yeah, when we look underneath of them, there's symptoms of something. What are they symptoms of, right? And so that's like, and I learned that in addictions treatment, is when you view addiction as a symptom instead of a problem, you get much closer to what's really going on and how you might affect meaningful change for somebody. When I think that we're at that place of there's a lot of Band-Aid fixes that we're trying to throw on these symptoms of underlying problems. And so when we ask, like, actually just defining the problem is an act of power. Right. And it's probably the primary act of power. Actually, when I think about the ability to define what the problem is for a group of people or for an individual or for society, to be able to point to the problem and define it using your own language and then decide what solution is required. Right? Mm-hmm. Like that was fundamentally what we would wrestle with, because I was working with youth in addictions treatment, and they would come in believing they had an addictions problem because their parents had told them they had an addictions problem. and their parents have the power to define the problem. And so the problem, but it's never the problem. We dig beneath it, and there's all kinds of layers to that problem. And eventually all roads lead to power was the realization.
Yeah.
And so my journey with power actually started in addictions treatment. And when we started to understand power better, we could understand addiction, which was just fascinating to me. It was probably the single most important breakthrough at the treatment program that I worked at was compassionate communication or nonviolent communication and right use of power. Those two models helped us understand the work we did with at the individual level. And then, of course, I put my head up and I start looking around society and I'm like, oh, this explains everything else too. Like this idea of power starts to explain the experiences we have as groups of people and in our organizations. So certainly is a passion of mine and why the show exists and why it's called Powerful and why I get to have these conversations. So where to for you from here? What's on your plate? You had mentioned you've been busy, so you've gone into the consulting field. You've been quite busy. It's a busy time, I imagine, for DEI and I work in general. No shortage of problems to tackle in organizations. You've mentioned connecting with a lot of practitioners from around the world, and I saw a post of yours actually the other day about maybe we need a trade association, maybe we need some sort of like body. So I imagine that could be a huge project. But what are you excited about right now in terms of your practice and work you're doing? What gets you up in the morning?
What gets me up in the morning, I think, I will say I'm very lucky to be able to continue saying what's on my mind and kind of speaking to this combination of my own experiences plus what I've learned in my education and, like how to show up for other communities and be a good ally. I've been able to speak to those things, but still, have an inflow of people interested in my work, which is, I'm totally grateful for. I don't know if that's a sign of the times or if I'm just in I am in a very privileged position where I am, hands down, but if other practitioners are noticing that too, I'm not sure. I know a lot of practitioners out there that are actually doing well, centering equity and justice. So that's great to hear. But that piece of it is what drives me, right? Like the revelations that I like, not revelations, but the kind of like aha moments when, I'm speaking to certain things and then I put like these buzzwords of bias and prejudice and all of these like DEI terminologies that are popular into the context of history and saying, oh, that's why, like when people understand, oh, that's why we're learning this, like that's why it's important, right? That's, I think, the thing that really, that's why I think a lot of DEI practitioners are lucky to be in that space, because you truly get some sort of it's very gratifying. You get some satisfaction out of the fact that you're doing this work and hopefully like you're seeing people like have those moments where like, wow, I really need to investigate this further at minimum. Right. So that's exciting for me. I think for me personally, my trajectory is I don't have like this plan. I did in the beginning have this like strategy, but things are sort of just happening to the point where like we're 2 months into to 2021 and I'm just kind of like, let's ride this out, see where things are going, because I'm getting like, I'm at the point where there's a lot of great word of mouth on what I'm doing, and I think people are interacting with my LinkedIn posts, and that helps some sort of organic marketing, and so people are like somewhat, at least, hopefully somewhat interested in what I'm talking about. So from me personally, I think there are people in my life that would be very upset to hear me say this, just kind of like winging it, but like especially my wife, who's very, very structured in a lot of things that she does, but like and no one wants to hear that they're winging it with their business, but there's been avenues that have come up that I would have never expected, and I would have never planned for it. And so I want to see where that takes me.
Awesome.
Ride this wave.
It's an exciting wave, and speaking from experience, we're all winging it. We're all trying to figure it out as we.
Oh, that's good to hear. That's reassuring.
Recommendations for people to, I mean, obviously I'll have links to your stuff, your LinkedIn profile and your website for people to check out the work that you're doing and the things that you're writing about. But people or books, authors, podcasts, resources that have been influential for you in the journey, or you find yourself recommending often to people, that I can put some links in for any listeners of this podcast. What do you recommend people start with when they're
I haven't finished, but it's influenced a lot of my most recent work. Is Cast by Isabel Wilkerson. Kind of gives you a framework for understanding the system in the United States, and it led me to kind of start framing our system like kind of like, you know, if like exactly like you were saying, if all of this DEI work and if all of these things that we see are the user interface of a system, like the CAST system is the source code, right? So that's how I frame it. I got a lot of that from reading Isabel Wilkerson. I would be remiss if I didn't sort of give a shout out to. I'm on the board of a local nonprofit called Service Never Sleeps, and they do a lot of great work in the around social justice, and they have an amazing. You can do the day-long training, but they also have it in like I think online format of an allyship training that they do, which was very, very influential for me because like I saw this and the head of the organization, Whitney Parnell, was the one that was doing this training, and I was like, wow, you can do this. Like you can do this and say these things. I mean, like out loud, right? Like it was real. It was like, it got, people were like mind blown, and like the 8 hours of the training didn't feel like 8 hours. It felt like an instant, and you're like the day is gone kind of, but it was so impactful. I mean, there are, if you want to kind of introduction to like a dip your foot in the water of inclusion, I do recommend The 4 Stages of Psychological Safety by Timothy Clark. I'm using a lot of his work in what I'm doing, particularly on the inclusion piece. I mean, there's not much conversation around justice, but which I'm supplementing, but it is a very good introduction to kind of creating some of the more culturally flat organizations that are power is a little bit more diffused, and you have the ability to input and kind of create this these robust dialogues. I mean, and all the big hits, of course, you can read White Fragility, you can read How to Be an Anti-Racist. They all have some degree of value. But I will say one of my most favorite books out there that also helped me on this journey was How to Be Less Stupid About Race. It like Dr. Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist, there is an element of the author going through a specific journey, but there's a degree of academic work in there, and then there's a degree of like just realness, and it's a wonderful way to get on this topic. I mean, there are a lot, so I'll leave it at that for now. But I guess like I tend to try and elevate some of these like some podcasts and some books that I'm reading on my LinkedIn. So if anybody wants to connect with me and share ideas, I'm always open.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate those recommendations, and I'm going to check out the How to Be Less Stupid About Race for sure. That one sounds intriguing, and
It's very good.
yeah, I agree with you on the work of Timothy Clark. He's been helpful for me in helping people unpack psychological safety, because the original research on it's kind of like anything. It gets boiled down to like a term, and people think they understand it, and it's much more nuanced than that. And so I appreciate the way he's nuanced it into actually different phases of this, or different experiences of psychological safety. One of my earliest podcasts was The Problem with Grit. So these like grit, growth mindset, and resiliency, and all of these buzzwords that we throw around, and it's just more hyper individualism in a lot of ways. And so yeah, I appreciate anybody who's got a nuanced perspective on some of these buzzwords.
Oh, I definitely have to listen to that one. I have my own problems with this the individualist mindset. I mean, there may be a place for grit, I think, in our society, but the way it is in its current manifest, it is very bro culture-esque. So,
yeah,
not a fan.
Yeah, you know who doesn't need to be told to develop more grit is anybody who's been marginalized and oppressed for their life and still managed to make it through that. So,
real quick, like I remember one time, like in one of my past work places. One of our affinity groups, our employee resource groups, like it was our women's group, and they were like constantly talking about, oh, we need resiliency training and we need these types of trainings. And I'm like, the only thing, like when people started talking about like that is, what if somebody came up to my mom and told her that we need to put you in a resiliency training? My mother's the most resilient person that I know. Like, if you're a woman or a person of color, you are by nature of the fact that you're here. You've survived. You're resilient. You don't need that training. The only thing we're doing is training people how to somewhat survive in a corrupt, problematic system. Change the system. But we can.
I am with you. It's actually what drove me out of addictions treatment finally, was I couldn't continue to deal with it at an individual level and try and give people coping mechanisms to deal with shitty life experiences and the misuses and abuses of power that they experienced on a regular basis. It's like I gotta shift gears and do more of that work.
Oh wow,
for sure. So I'm with you. We could talk much longer, but I want to be mindful of your time. You've got a young baby in the house. You got a 5-month-old. I got 3 kids. I got to get to bed here at some point. So we'll probably call it here. I am going to direct people to check you out on the web, criticalequity.com, and to connect with you on LinkedIn. I'll have links to all this in the show notes as well. Farzin, thank you so much for carving out some time, and a pleasure to chat. These are big and important questions that we are wrestling with as a society right now, and I'm thankful to be a part of your journey and to listen in on your conversations on LinkedIn. They're always enlightening. So thank you for that.
I appreciate it. Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
You bet. We'll chat soon.
All right, sounds good.